Hi there. Just like to share some thoughts with you today about why we use an outcomes-based approach and what it really means at a practical level. So this is outcomes as a focus for planning and also for performance measurement. So outcomes, when we look at it from a government perspective, so even though we're talking about this from a government perspective today, recognize it from if you're in a non-profit or if you're in a profit business, this is just as valid to focus on outcomes or results rather than focusing on what is done, for example. So government agencies and departments, they work and collaborate together to deliver impact on community outcomes. So in Australia, we focus on outcomes, and it's actually legislated through the PGPA. And this approach is being used around the world. And it's because we need to move away from thinking about all of our outputs and all the activity that we do to focusing on the outcomes from a planning perspective, but also from a measurement point of view. So we can then see the difference that we're making and the difference that the things that we're doing, the impact that they're having. So why outcomes? So the argument for outcomes has been led by a bunch of academics over the years, but there's social arguments for it, there's economic arguments, and there's management arguments for it, as you can see here. But the key thing here is that the social arguments is that if we actually want to make things better, we have to understand whether the interventions we're putting in place or the actions we're putting in place are actually making a difference or not. And the only way to do that is to focus on the outcome and measure the impact of the influence that we're having. The same applies then for that economic argument. And that is, if we have limited resources available to us, how do we make sure that the limited resources we have are being used to the maximum effect? And it's by focusing on outcomes. Same then from a management point of view. This is how we develop insights into what works and what doesn't. So therefore, we can make better decisions around the impact we're going to have on the outcomes that are clear to us rather than focusing on our activity. So the background of this apparently goes back to the 1960s, and this comes from the Kellogg Foundation. And we've got to remember that in the early 1900s, organizations like General Motors, who were the first one to have a strategic plan, they really focused on all of their activity. But the management team and the leadership team connected in some way that activity through to financial outcomes. So it was really looking at the way those two things connected. Maybe that wasn't as scientific as they thought it was at the time, and it definitely wasn't as evidence-based, but they drew those links in some way and therefore made decisions. By the time we got to the 1960s, they were really trying to focus on how do you make that shift to those outcomes-based approaches. And the point here is that we move away from what was done to the difference that was made from what was done. So therefore, the outcomes, the concept behind this then really comes about program outcomes, population outcomes, personal outcomes, what happens means to me. So therefore, we're looking at a relationship between an intervention, an action that we take that then has an effect, cause and effect. And even if we're in non-government organizations, what we're really looking for is to understand this cause and effect. The better that we can understand that, the better we can have an influence on changing the impact that occurs and an influence on understanding what the difference is between cause and effect. So therefore, the intervention interacts with multiple different factors. A lot of times we want to argue that we can only focus on what's done because there are other factors that take place. Sure, that's the world we live in. But we need to understand then what influence, the impact of the influence we're having. This also applies for non-government organizations as well, because a lot of times those longer term outcomes that we're trying to have an impact on, there will be other factors that have an impact on it. It doesn't change that we need to understand our level of influence over those outcomes. So outcomes, it's really resulting from that specific service or that intervention. What are the changes that have come from it? So when we've done things with our customers or in our organization, what is the overall impact that comes from that? And it's really then at a government level and then looking at the difference that's occurred in the community. What difference have we made? So the outcomes, as we're saying here, are the end result of what we want to achieve for that community that's at the end of the chain of all of these results and outcomes that we're working towards. So we often use program logic model as an example of saying, this is the stuff that we have, this is our inputs, this is our activities, they're the outputs, which eventually lead to outcomes. One of the deceptive things I think about program logic models is that it makes us think that things are linear, whereas it's not quite as simple as that in the world. It's a bit more complex. Anyway, let's use it as a model. So we want to move away, when we're focusing on outcomes, we want to move away from what was done to the difference that made. Therefore, we want to try and look at the changes resulting from those services or the interventions that we put in place, which means then we have to look at the relationship between the intervention and the outcome. That's cause and effect. Can be linear and it is a direct. It's cause and effect. And that's what we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to look at monitoring. So that the intervention then interacts with multiple other factors, but we still have an impact on that outcome, on what we're trying to measure and understand from that planning and that measurement point of view is what the influence we have on those outcomes. So in the next part of this, we will then look at how we design an outcomes-based framework through collaboration with stakeholders that becomes an evidence-based measurement framework. Anyway, I hope this has been of value and thanks for watching.